My name's Gavin, and I grew up in the suburbs of Pittsburgh. We lived not too far from this mall that my friends and I would frequently visit. It wasn't super big, but it did have the things you might expect. There was a food court, those big clothing stores, a little kids' play area, and other types of stores selling random items. There was even a movie theater nearby, though it wasn't actually inside of the mall. At some point, the mall got a new mall cop who got a reputation for being insanely strict. He was this old skinny dude in his 60s with a wrinkled face and short gray hair. We all called him Crazy Eddie, and he wasn't someone you wanted to mess with. One time, me and my group of friends were sitting down at one of the tables in the food court, minding our own business and having a discussion with what I thought was a normal volume. Then out of nowhere, Crazy Eddie walked over and started shouting for us to be quiet, ironically speaking a lot louder than we were. He also pointed to a paper plate and soda can on the floor next to us and told us to stop making a mess. It wasn't ours, and I wanted to tell him that, but I knew the best thing was to just let it go. One day, my 3 friends and I came there on a weekend. We were around 13 at the time, and I'll refer to them as Ben, Lucas, and Mike. Lucas's mom had dropped us off around 2:30 and told us to call her when we were ready to be picked up, and that we needed to be home in time for dinner. Therefore, we had about 2 hours to do whatever we wanted. Much like we usually did, we hit up the candy store and then walked around. I remember there was this smoking hot chick who worked in the Abercrombie & Fitch store, so we always made it a point to go over there. We wandered around a few other places, including Hot Topic, Spencer's, and this place that sold stereos and sound systems. After that, it was like 4. We started walking back to the food court to get one more round of snacks before calling Lucas's mom. For the record, I remember exactly what we were doing when this went down. Ben and Mike had just gotten those pretzels with cheese, and Ben was handing the cashier money when we heard this yelling coming from one end of the food court.
Ich kann kotzen!
Everyone fell silent and looked in that direction. It took us a moment to see what was going on, but eventually we saw a man throwing his arms up in the air and shouting obscenities and things like, "You can't do this," and "You can't fire me." We realized it was Crazy Eddie. My friends and I put 2 and 2 together and figured he must have just been fired, which honestly wasn't that surprising. Maybe he had lost his temper in a meeting with one of his superiors. We didn't know. A crowd started to gather around him in a circle, and a moment later 2 other security guards, who I assume were still employed, walked inside of the circle and tried to calm him down. That only seemed to make Eddie more upset, and eventually 2 real cops showed up. They couldn't talk him down either, and any moment we were sure Eddie was about to get tased. Instead, one of the cops ended up tackling him, and after putting him in cuffs, they escorted him out of the building. Now, I'm not totally sure this happened, but after Eddie had left the building, Ben started telling us how Eddie had been looking at us as he walked by. As far as we knew, Eddie didn't have a problem with us specifically, and the incident with him yelling at us in the food court had taken place several months ago. But maybe the fact that this current incident also took place in the food court, and that Eddie had walked relatively close to us on his way out, made him get upset with us or blame us for what happened. Either way, we called Lucas's mom and she picked us up. She overheard our discussion about what happened in the car and grew somewhat concerned. She told us that if we saw Eddie at the mall again to let someone know. We told her we would, though honestly none of us expected him to show up there again after leaving in such a hysterical manner. Little did we know what was in store. I think it was 2 weekends later that Lucas's mom again dropped us off at the mall. Ben wasn't with us that day, so it was just me, Lucas, and Mike. I can't remember us talking about Eddie on the way over, so I guess we let it go by that time. But right after we got out of the van and Lucas's mom drove off, Lucas started joking that he saw Eddie. Mike and I looked at the front entrance to see someone standing against one of the doors wearing a red hoodie, sunglasses, and blue jeans. Because they were wearing glasses, we couldn't tell for sure who it was, but the man's build and height matched Eddie's, and as we walked closer, we started to suspect that it was really him. Eventually we were only like 15 feet away, and I think Lucas asked, "Is that you, Eddie?" The man didn't say a word, but instead began walking towards us. We were all taken aback, and I felt my body tense up as he came closer, but then he just kept walking past us and into the parking lot. He didn't even look at us as he walked by, he just kept looking forward. We stood there watching him until we eventually lost sight of him in the rows of cars. Mike, Lucas, and I all looked at each other, remarking how weird that was. Now that I got a better look at his face, I was like 95% sure that was Eddie, but why he was just waiting outside the mall, and why he didn't say anything, made no sense. I think we waited another minute or 2 to see if he came back, but when he didn't, we walked inside. This trip to the mall played out largely the same after that, with us hitting up the food court and most of the same stores. Of course we kept joking about Eddie, with one of us periodically stopping and telling the other two that Eddie was hiding right around the corner. But then, it actually happened. While we were walking on the lower level, Lucas looked up to one of the walkways above us and stopped. "It's that same dude," I heard him say. Sure enough, it was that same guy in the red hoodie and blue jeans, and even though we were inside the mall, he was still wearing his glasses. He was just standing there, looking down at us. None of us knew what to do, but before we could react, the man turned and walked away out of sight. Now Mike and Lucas and I were a bit creeped out, but we weren't really scared, especially since we were still in the mall and there were 3 of us. Eventually we decided to try to find the man, mostly out of curiosity to see if it really was Eddie. Therefore we walked over to the escalator leading up to the food court on the 2nd level, which was relatively nearby to where we were standing. Of course, when we got up there, the man was nowhere in sight. We didn't see him again for the rest of that trip, and we all agreed not to mention what happened to Lucas's mom. Again, we weren't really afraid, and we didn't want Lucas's mom to stop driving us to the mall on weekends. Then on Thursday at school, while we were getting off the buses, Lucas found us and told us something. There was a suspicious car that pulled up in front of his house last night. Apparently it had arrived sometime while Lucas and his family were eating dinner, and when his mom happened to walk by the window and see it, it took off. Mike, Ben, and I all made the connection with Eddie, since we'd filled Ben in on what happened when he wasn't there. Lucas still hadn't told his mom what happened last weekend at the mall, and we still didn't want to for some reason. Honestly, none of us knew what to do though. We didn't end up telling anyone, partly because we weren't 100% sure that was Eddie, or that he had been the one to park in front of Lucas's house. We went to the mall several more times over the next 2 months, but didn't see anything suspicious. We had a strange mix of paranoia and excitement whenever one of our moms would drop us off. It was still usually Lucas's mom, but Ben's mom also dropped us off once. Eventually the feeling started to subside and our trips returned to normal, and I think that's what made this one final encounter all the more terrifying. This was late into the school year, sometime in April I think, and it was another Saturday afternoon. All 4 of us were there that time, and things were going as usual. Eventually Ben had to use the restroom, and so Lucas, Mike, and I followed him in to goof around. But before he even got fully inside the bathroom, Ben came back towards us. He looked shocked, and told us Eddie was in there. We asked Ben how he knew, and he told us it was that same guy in the red hoodie and he was still wearing his sunglasses. Mike asked Ben what he was doing, and Ben told us he was just standing there, looking in the mirror. Needless to say, that was pretty odd, and if it had only been 1 or 2 of us, we probably would have been too scared to go in. But with all 4 of us, I guess we felt more confident, because we started to sneak in and look around the corner. The guy wasn't there. Mike started to joke that Ben had just been messing with us, but Ben swore that he had been standing there a moment earlier. We quietly walked fully into the bathroom and didn't see anyone at the urinals or sinks. That just left the stalls. Lucas bent down and looked under them, and sure enough there were 2 boots in one of the stalls. Now we didn't know what to do. We were extremely curious what this guy's deal was, but we also weren't really hooligans and didn't want to mess with someone on the toilet. However, before Ben, Mike, or I could do anything, Lucas blurted out, "Hey Eddie!" The echo reverberated off the walls, and we just stood there. Whoever was in the toilet didn't make a sound. All 3 of us just wanted to get out of there at that point, but Lucas actually walked over in front of the stall and said, "Eddie?" What happened next was straight out of a horror movie. Lucas jumped back as the door shot open. He dodged it by like a millimeter, and we tailed it out of the bathroom without even looking behind us. When we got out of the hallway leading to the bathroom and back into a crowded area, we slowed down but kept walking quickly. Eventually we turned around and our blood ran cold. There was the same guy in a red hoodie and dark glasses, about 30 feet behind us. His face was expressionless, just like the other time we saw him, and though we still didn't know if that was Eddie or what his deal was, him following us was genuinely terrifying. Now, we probably should have gotten help, like by going to the mall office or looking for a mall cop, but the fact that Lucas had messed with him in the bathroom and likely provoked the man made us not want to do that. Instead, we started walking to one of the entrances on the opposite side of the mall, hoping we'd lose him in the crowd. We didn't though. When we got to the doors, we walked through them, our hearts pounding in our chests. I don't think any of us had planned out where to go next, and it was probably more dangerous for us to be outside than inside, so we were praying to God he wouldn't follow us out. This entrance had a little area with benches, a small fountain, and a sculpture, and after we shut the doors behind us, we walked over to the other side of the fountain and waited. My stomach sank when I saw the man press his face against the door. However, nothing could prepare us for what happened next. The man actually reached into his hoodie and pulled out a knife. My friends and I stood there motionless. From the other side of the glass, the man raised it up to about the level of his chest, held it there for a few seconds, then put it back in his hoodie. Then he just turned and walked away. There were a few other people in the entrance area, but I don't think any of them saw what just happened. Eventually, Mike, Ben, Lucas, and I decided to walk over to the movie theater, since there was no way we were going back inside the mall. Lucas called his mom to pick us up and told her we'd be at the movie theater. Then we all walked around the outside of the mall, since we had come out on the other side, and then to the movie theater. There was a little arcade area, and we got some snacks and just hung out there until Lucas's mom arrived 30 minutes later. We couldn't really get engrossed in any of the games, as we were all still paranoid that guy would show up. Finally, Lucas's mom texted that she was outside, and we filed out of the movie theater and into her van. We did our best to act natural, and when Lucas's mom asked us what movie we saw, one of us said something random. I can't remember what. We all agreed not to go back to the mall anytime soon, and we also agreed not to tell anyone. In hindsight, that was a poor decision, since it meant an armed and potentially very dangerous person was on the loose. Even though nothing we did would have warranted a guy coming at us with a knife, in our minds, Lucas still provoked that man, and we also told ourselves that he'd be long gone by the time the cops tried to find him. We didn't go back to the mall for like 4 months, in which time Lucas and his family moved away, and when Ben, Mike, and I did go, we never saw that man again. We were still paranoid for a while whenever we'd go back, but as the weeks and months passed, what happened faded into memory. We also didn't see anything like suspicious cars or anything else like that. We've since graduated from high school and I've moved away to college, so this incident took place a long time ago now. But I still can't help but wonder if that man really was Eddie, and even if not, what he might have done to us. Back when I was a little kid, I lived near my older cousin Caleb's house, and sometimes my aunt would take us to the mall about 30 minutes away from where we lived. We'd go there on weekends, since there wasn't a lot else to do where we lived. For the most part, our trips were pretty fun, and my cousin and I would play in the little play area they had and run around the planters and up and down the stairs. This was definitely an older mall, and not super big, but it was still fun to explore, and my aunt would always get us candy and most times a toy as well. However, one trip to the mall turned out to be downright terrifying. It was late one Saturday morning and had been raining off and on. My aunt and cousin and I were in her blue Nissan, reading the books my aunt always kept in her car for us to read. I think I was around 5 at this time, and I'm pretty sure Caleb was 8. As we pulled onto the wet asphalt of the parking lot, Caleb and I saw some kind of attraction set up further away and immediately got excited. The moment my aunt parked, my cousin and I bolted out of the car and took off running, as she called after us to slow down. Now, I don't remember exactly what this thing was supposed to be, but there was something like a trailer where you could walk inside and then it was like you were supposed to be in an airplane. I think this might have been sponsored by an airline company or travel agency, but I'm not sure. I remember there were 2 workers wearing lanyards sitting at a table under a tent. They greeted Caleb and I as we walked up and asked if we'd ever flown in a plane before. At that point in my life, I don't think either of us had been on a plane before, which made this experience a lot cooler. One of the workers started talking to us about plane safety, and when my aunt walked up, the other one mentioned something about a raffle. Honestly, I have no idea what the deal was. Anyway, there wasn't any cost to get in, and we were the only ones there, so we walked right up. I remember there were like 5 or 6 stairs that led to a corner and then to an aisle like in the middle of a passenger area. There were only like 5 or 6 rows, each one with a seat on either side of the aisle and an airplane-style window on the side. There were also these little information signs and plastic holders, but I don't remember what they said. Caleb and I were most excited about the cockpit. Before our aunt could even finish telling us to wait since we might not be supposed to go in there, Caleb and I pushed open the little plastic door and started yelling about how cool it was. I doubt any of this was real aircraft equipment, but the plastic panels with switches, lights, and other instruments were really detailed. There were 2 seats for the pilot and co-pilot, and Caleb and I each got in one before joking around and playing some kind of musical chairs. We only spent around 5 minutes there, since aside from reading the information signs, there wasn't anything else to do. My aunt led us back down the stairs, and the 2 employees asked us if we had fun. Caleb and I shouted our approval as my aunt thanked them for letting us go inside. After that, we walked into the mall, coming in at the food court/play area. The main part of our trip here went pretty much the same as usual. We got lunch at one of the restaurants in the food court, then my aunt watched us as we played on the play equipment and stopped us when we started climbing on the brick planters. We walked around and visited some of the stores, including the one candy store we always went to, and my aunt got Caleb and I our favorite candy. Towards the end of our trip, Caleb and I started to get excited about the airplane attraction again. I'm not sure why. My aunt agreed to let us go back through it one more time, on the condition that that would be the last thing we do before leaving the mall. Eventually we made our way outside again, and Caleb and I ran over to the trailer thing. But then something happened that almost led to me getting kidnapped. Right before Caleb and I got to the entrance, my aunt saw one of Caleb's teachers and apparently wanted him to speak with her. Caleb started to complain, but his mom told him firmly to wait and speak with this person. I instinctively looked at my aunt, but she gestured that I could go ahead in. I said hi to the workers, who recognized me from earlier, and ran back into the trailer. It was exactly like I had remembered. This time I decided to sit in a few of the seats and look out the windows. There wasn't much to see except the parking lot, mall, and overcast sky. Then I walked to the cockpit and pushed open the door, only to receive one of the greatest shocks of my life. There, in the pilot's chair, was a man. He looked pretty overweight, to the point I wasn't sure how he fit through the door, and he must have been dead quiet because I didn't hear him at all. The man was also looking right at the door as I opened it, so our eyes made contact immediately, and it was extremely awkward. It was also extremely creepy, as it seemed that man was just waiting for someone to enter. When he saw me, the man immediately began to smile and introduced himself as Steven. He asked if I liked airplanes and wanted to sit in the cockpit seat next to him. In my shock, I wasn't able to say anything, but Steven kept smiling and told me he was alright and that he frequently surprised people, whatever that meant. I started backing up, but the man started protesting and apologizing for scaring me. Finally, I managed to say, "No, it's okay." But in a flash, Steven's expression changed from happy and apologetic to annoyed. He continued to insist that I see what was in the cockpit and that he knew a lot about planes. While I might have considered telling Steven that I had explored it earlier, I wanted no part of this conversation now. Steven suddenly stood up, and that was it. I turned around and ran to the back of the trailer. As I did so, I heard a brushing sound, which I assumed was from Steven trying to fit through the narrow cockpit door. I tried to run, but a hand reached out and grabbed me a second later. Without looking back, I instinctively screamed and punched behind me. That was apparently enough to make Steven let go. I ran down the steps and back to where Caleb and my aunt were standing. Caleb's teacher was there too, and whether or not they heard my scream, they immediately realized something was wrong. While I started to explain out of breath, my aunt actually let out a small scream of her own as she saw that man's face peeking at us from one of the windows in the trailer. He immediately moved out of view when he noticed us noticed him, and he actually came down the staircase a moment later. I suspect he was planning to walk over to try to convince us it was all just a misunderstanding, but the two employees working at the trailer had already noticed me run out and become concerned. Before Steven could walk over, one of the employees, an older man in his 40s or 50s, immediately walked in front of him and asked him sternly what he was doing there. Apparently they weren't even aware he had been hiding out in the trailer. I guess he must have snuck in when they were on break or something. Steven started talking rapidly and gesturing at me, and he and the two workers started to raise their voices. Then it looked like Steven tried to turn and run, but the man walked in front of him again. While the other worker, a skinny lady in her 30s, took out her phone and called someone, Steven made another break for it. This time he took off running in the opposite direction, behind the trailer, but the guy who worked there was quick and ran after him. We all heard a thud, and then a scream of pain, as he apparently tackled Steven on the other side. Caleb and I, along with his aunt and his teacher, were still just standing there, watching these events unfold. The lady who worked at the trailer came up to us and started apologizing and asked us, and me specifically, if we were all right. We told her we were okay. A moment later, a mall security guard walked over, followed by a cop car pulling up several minutes after that. Our group had decided to stay so we could talk to the police when they arrived, and that's just what we did. This whole time, Steven and the male employee were still behind the trailer out of view, and I assumed the man had been holding Steven there, preventing him from leaving. Eventually, the cop who had walked over to them came back around with Steven in cuffs. This time he was silent, and didn't even look at us as he was escorted to the car. After that, the cops thanked us for reporting what happened and let us know they'd contact us if they had any further questions. My aunt never heard back from them as far as I know, and whether Stephen, or whatever his name was, actually went to prison, I have no idea. The car ride home was extremely awkward and we didn't say much. My aunt had called my mom, so of course she was hysterical, and when we pulled up to my house, my mom ran over and threw her arms around me. My aunt and cousin and I didn't go back to the mall for a while after that, but when we eventually did, nothing like that happened ever again. I don't think they ever had a similar attraction either. I still think about this memory from time to time, including the image I saw when I first opened the cockpit door with that man sitting in the pilot's seat. It just goes to show how messed up some people can be, and I'm just glad that I was able to get away. I'll start by saying that for the longest time I didn't think this memory was real, like it was just a dream or I had imagined it at some point. But while going through some of my parents' belongings recently, which included a few thumb drives, I came across several pictures which seemed to confirm that this did indeed happen. It's hard to describe exactly what I felt when I found the pictures. My dad and I used to do everything together when I was a kid, while my mom would usually look after my younger brothers. My dad would also take me with him on business trips sometimes during the summer, and those are some of the best childhood memories I have. He passed away 8 years ago, and my mom passed earlier this year. Needless to say, those were difficult times for me and my family, and maybe it's because I just found out this was a real memory with my dad that I felt inspired to share this story. Based on what I remember of this memory and the pictures I found, I'm like 99% sure this took place while I was accompanying him on one of his business trips, and I'm also pretty sure we went there just once. For context, my dad was a regional manager for a chain of clothing stores, and he'd make day trips and trips lasting several days somewhat regularly. Some of the stores were in malls, so some of the trips involved us going there. He'd always watch as I played in the playground areas, and we'd walk around exploring each mall after he finished whatever it was he had to do. While he did that, I'd usually wait for him and read books in the break room or another part of the employees only section. One time we must have visited this mall that had a rather unconventional design. Maybe it's more proper to call it a shopping center, I don't know. There was this little courtyard area in the shape of a diamond, with two sides bordering the parking lot and the other two sides having a row of stores. Overall, things were in this big concrete structure with a concrete ceiling of sorts by the place where the two sides of stores met. There was also a stairway there that led up to an enclosed shopping area. I'm reasonably sure the enclosed area had 2 levels and the stairway led to the second floor, so why they didn't just build a level walkway, I have no idea. I think there were 2 anchors, one of which must have been my dad's store. The other anchor store was weird, and I think that combined with the strange concrete outer section convinced me this was just a dream or my imagination. From what I remember, the store was like a supermarket that also sold some furniture, and it had this huge central display with chairs stacked on top of each other. There was also this fountain-like area that had running water along one side of the store. I think it was by the exterior entrance and cart return area. Maybe this is like something you'd see at a Bass Pro Shop, but I'm almost completely sure that wasn't what this was. The store also had these weird types of mannequins, a distinctive odor, and a very 90s color scheme despite this taking place around 2010. Backing up to when we arrived, my dad and I parked by the courtyard and walked to one of the stores under the concrete awning. I think this was a weekday morning and the mall had just opened. I remember there weren't a lot of people around. We went into this place I'm pretty sure was a pawn shop that also sold collectible items. My dad and I looked around a bit, and there was this back room with valuable coins and glass displays. I remember getting fascinated with some of them, and incidentally, my dad must have taken a picture because that is one of the pictures I found that convinced me this wasn't a dream. I'm not sure how much time we spent there, but eventually we made our way to one of the other stores in the big diamond area. I think it was a fast food place where we got slices of pizza. Then we made our way up the staircase, which was also another place my dad took a picture of us. From there, we walked into the upper level of the mall and must have gone to his store, because the next thing I remember was waiting in a break room. After reading one of the books my dad had brought for me, I remember getting up and looking around the room. There was a sink and a fridge and a microwave. There was also this very distinctive poster with some guy making a silly face. I'm not sure what it was about, but the image just stuck in my mind. Then the door to the room opened and a man came in. At first he didn't say anything, but then he asked me in a soft voice if I needed anything. I shook my head. A few seconds later, the man asked why I was in the break room, to which I told him something to the effect of, I was waiting for my dad. I don't remember exactly how the conversation went, but the man eventually convinced me that he was an employee at the store and that he knew my dad. He told me that my dad's meeting was running long and that he'd sent him to check and see how I was doing. I remember there was something unsettling about this man's appearance, like he had some kind of deformity, but I'm not sure what it was. The man told me that my dad wanted us to get some snacks from one of the other stores in the mall. I'm not sure how suspicious I was of him at this point, but I let him lead me back into the main part of the clothing store and then over to the supermarket. I remember the man started holding onto my arm at some point, which I didn't feel comfortable with, and us walking through sliding doors into the supermarket. I asked the man where the snacks were, and after a moment he pointed towards the big central display and told me they were there. So we walked over, but when we got there the man apologized and said he misremembered, and that they were actually in another aisle, which incidentally was right next to the exterior exit leading to another parking lot. I'm pretty sure this is where I started to get suspicious, and when I noticed he was leading me to the card return area, the one with the long fountain next to it, I finally told the man we had to go back. I can't remember what he said, but he didn't let go of my arm. I repeated my request louder and eventually yanked myself away from him. I remember he just stood there, and a second later he bolted to the exit and outside. This is where the memory ends. I assume no one in the store witnessed what was going on, and I just walked back to my dad's store. I also assumed that I didn't tell my dad what happened, since he would have been furious and probably would have called the police, and my memory would have been a lot clearer. Overall, this whole experience, including discovering later that it wasn't just a dream, is just so surreal. It's scary, but also sad, since it was a memory that involved my dad before he passed away. I'd just like to say that you can never be too careful in public areas, and if you have kids, please teach them not to be afraid to speak up in public if they need help. Thinking back now, I can only wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away.